All right, so let's take a look at mocking services, right? So this is the one of those 3 or 4 challenges that we spoke early, right? That oftentimes our front-end applications depend on data that lives elsewhere in some remote resource, right? And we need to be able to mock those so that instead of hitting some live data, right, instead we can provide some known data, right, and then compare the rendering against some expected results with a known input, right? So let's see about mocking the service. So what Jest gives us is a way to mock any function that is used in your application. You can replace it with this Jest.function name. That what it'll do is that it will redirect any function calls that would have gone to the normal to this normal function. It will now be instead redirected to whatever you tell it to redirect it to. So for instance, here the global.fetch function, the fetch function that we use to go and fetch data to the remote server, the one that generates the gets, the posts, the puts, and the deletes, right? Okay, we can replace all that. We can say, hey, instead of using the dot fetch, the global function dot fetch, I am going to redefine it. I'm going to replace it. It's going to be overwritten completely, right? Obviously within my test, right? Within my test, I'm going to replace it instead with the Jest.function dot. Now this dot function provides all sorts of nifty little cool things. One of the things that it provides is what it's called a mock implementation. A mock implementation, meaning that this function will take the place, this dot mock implementation function will take the place of the dot fetch. If you call dot fetch anywhere, such as user service, right? User service calls dot fetch everywhere, yeah. Instead, it's going to call this function. So any arguments that would have gone to this dot fetch instead are going to be redirected to this one implementation. Right? So the URL, localhost 8080/API/users blah blah blah, right? Instead of going to the real fetch, it's going to go to this function you have here. And here's what you can replace the original implementation with whatever you want, right? You can return from here anything that you would expect, or whatever you would want to use as a test from this service. So what this allows us to do is to mock services, right, that depend on remote resources with something that we can control now, right? So for instance, what we can do in a separate file here, in a separate file called user-service.mock, right? What we've done is that inside our, instead of doing a return right here, instead of this return, whatever I want, instead we're going to put these if statements. We're going to say, if the URL that comes in is /users/321, right? If that's what's coming in, what I'm going to do, I'm going to return a promise, right? Because that's exactly what fetch does, right? Fetch goes out to the server, right? And it doesn't block, right? It doesn't block. It immediately returns a promise, right, to whoever called this, so that they can wait for the server to come back with a value. And so we return a promise immediately, and then we execute this promise, and we resolve it by right. If you remember, the actual code of the user service was to go fetch, does a fetch with a URL, and then it did a response.json. I remember that, and that JSON function basically parsed the HTTP body, right? Converted it into a JSON object, but all that is gone. Right? All that is gone. Right? We're not doing it. We're not using the original fetch at all. Right? But nevertheless, our user service implementation does call response.json. Yes? So it has to believe that indeed there is a function called .json. Right? So what we're returning here is a function I call JSON, because we know that the server is going to call .json on the response. So when it calls it, this is what we're going to return. Right? We can control exactly what we want to return. Here we're returning just a mocked object Alice with a value 321, username and password. Right? We can tell it exactly what we're returning. We can also make this a little more generic. Instead of saying /user /321, that could be some pattern, right, or some input field, right, that we can parse and then dynamically manipulate this object based on that input. Also, if you remember, the user service also implements the /users, right, to go fetch all the users, right, to go fetch all the users. That's what our little component does, right? It fetches all the users and then it rendered a list of users. So here we're also returning a promise right away, right? Notice that it's an else if. So depending what the URL is, you're either going to return one object, or instead my JSON function is going to return an array of objects of Alice, Bob, and Charlie. With these IDs 1, 2, and 3. And our test, here's a test that would test the find user by ID. Right? We can try it out. We can say we can call user service.find user by ID. That's going to call fetch, right? It thinks it's going to go out to HTTP localhost 8080. Instead, right, what's going to get here is it's going to get a hold of a response object. That response object is going to have a JSON function. You call that JSON function, and that JSON function is going to return a single object. Right? The single object that returns is this one. It's Alice 321, and username Alice and password Alice. So the test, it says, well, I want to see that the user is, expect user dot to be defined, meaning it's not null, it's not undefined, right? It's not an empty string. I can even parse the object. I want to verify that indeed it's 321. I can check that the username is Alice. So my test now can exercise the user service all by itself, independently, right? Without actually going out to the server. Right, now I can test my user service because we have overwritten the implementation of fetch. Same thing with all users. We can check to see that the user's object comes back, is defined, that it's an array, that it has a length of 3, and that the first element's ID is a 1. Right? Alice ID is 1.